The strange thing about leaving a good man is that no one prepares you for how guilty grief can feel. A week after Mara left Daniel, the apartment still behaved as though he might come home. That was the first cruelty of it. Nothing in the rooms had learned the truth yet. Not the dish towel folded over the oven handle with its careful corners. Not the blue ceramic bowl by the sink where he used to leave the dog's tablets beside a glass of water so he would not forget them after dinner. Not the coffee beans in the jar, the kind he always bought before they were low, as though running out of anything domestic might count as a private moral failure. Not the blanket on the couch, still draped in the middle the way it had landed the last night they sat there together, shoulder to shoulder, sharing a silence that had once felt like peace and lately had begun to feel like erasure. Even the dog had not learned it. At 6:20 every evening, Pippa went to the door and sat there with a patience that made Mara ache. Her ears lifted at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Her little body leaned forward at the turning of keys that belonged to other people. Her tail tapped the floor once, twice, then stopped. The first night Mara watched it happen, she crouched beside her and pressed her mouth into the soft fur at the top of Pippa's head so the dog would not hear her crying. By the 7th night, the crying had become quieter. Not less, just quieter. It had moved deeper inside her, like water slipping underground. She had thought the hardest part would be the leaving itself. She had thought it would be the moment of saying the words aloud, of watching them land in Daniel's face, of seeing disbelief move through him so slowly it almost looked like calm. She had thought it would be the way he stood in the kitchen with one hand still on the back of a chair, as though his body had not yet caught up to what his life had just become. She had thought it would be the hour afterward, when they sat apart on opposite ends of the couch and spoke in careful, almost polite sentences about practical things that suddenly seemed obscene to discuss. The rent, the lease, the dog, the box in the hallway closet with the winter scarves, his tools, her grandmother's lamp, whose name the internet bill was under. She had thought heartbreak would look more like breaking. But the real ache had begun later, after the door had already closed. It began in the ordinary places. It began when she came home from the grocery store and realized she had bought his cereal by habit and stood in the kitchen staring at the box, as though it belonged to a version of herself she had not buried properly. It began when she woke in the middle of the night because she heard a sound from the other room and, for one suspended second, believed Daniel would be the one to go check it. It began when her car made a strange clicking noise and she reached for her phone before remembering there was no one to call who would say, without irritation or theater, "Don't worry, I'll come." That was one of the worst parts. Daniel had always come. He came with jumper cables and umbrellas and antiseptic cream. He came with grocery bags and replacement batteries and the exact tea she liked when her stomach hurt. He came with practical steadiness, with the quietly competent love of a man who noticed which hinge squeaked and which bill was due and which shelf needed bracing before it actually collapsed. He remembered to put gas in her car. He set aside the ripe avocados because he knew she hated when they turned too fast. He kept an extra phone charger in the living room because she was always forgetting where hers was. He never let the dog food run low. When she worked late, he cooked. When she got overwhelmed, he made things smaller, easier, solvable. There were women, she knew, who would have called that enough. There were women who would have said, "You had a good man." There were women who would have said, "At our age, do you know how rare that is?" There were women who would have taken one look at the life they had built. The tidy kitchen, the Sunday grocery trips, the nights on the couch, the dog curled at their feet, the soft certainty of shared logistics, and called it love in its adult form. Real love. The kind that outlasted sparks and grew into partnership. Sometimes Mara tried to say the same thing to herself. Sometimes, lying awake in the half-empty bed, she would list his goodness like evidence in a trial she was losing. He was kind. He was faithful. He never humiliated you. He never raised his voice. He made your life easier. He remembered what mattered. He showed up. Then, because grief was cruel and truth was crueler, something inside her would answer. Yes. Again still. And still, she had spent the last year of their relationship feeling like a woman slowly disappearing in a well-kept home. And still, she had sat beside him some nights with her entire body full of unsaid things, and watched him scroll through his phone or stare at the television, or ask whether they needed more dish soap, and felt a loneliness so specific it embarrassed her. And still, she had missed him before she left him. That was the part she could hardly admit even to herself. The cleaner version of the story was easier to carry. Things had gone stale, they had become more like roommates, the passion had faded, the relationship had run its course. Those were adult words, respectable words, words that made it sound mutual, almost natural, like a season ending. But beneath them was a more humiliating truth. She had not felt wanted. Not in the shallow way people often assumed when they heard that word, not like vanity, not like a request to be admired endlessly or desired with adolescent intensity. It was more intimate than that, more tender. She had wanted to feel reached for. Wanted him to look up when she entered a room and let something in his face register that her presence still mattered as a living thing, not just a familiar one. Wanted him to touch her sometimes without it being a prelude to sleep or a passing gesture on the way to something else. Wanted a compliment that arrived without prompting. Wanted to feel that the version of her who was a woman, soft, vivid, uncertain, sensual, inward, had not vanished into the version of her who remembered vet appointments and split utility bills and knew where they kept the spare light bulbs. She wanted to be beloved inside the life, not merely useful to it. That sentence had taken her months to form, and by the time she could have said it, she was already packing a bag. Mara had not always been a woman who left. For most of her life, she had been a woman who stayed. She stayed through awkwardness, through distance, through undernourishment so subtle it could pass for maturity. She was patient in the way girls often become when they learn early that asking for more can be interpreted as ingratitude. Her mother had been a woman of order, devotion, and fatigue, dinner on the table at 6, school forms signed, laundry folded warm from the dryer, medicine when you were sick, hair brushed smooth before picture day, the whole architecture of care. But tenderness had not lived easily in her. Praise came rarely. Affection was practical. Love was proven through maintenance. Her father was harder to read. He loved in flashes, beautifully when present, generously when in the mood. But his interior weather changed without warning, and everyone in the house learned to feel for pressure shifts. Some evenings he came home expansive, all warmth and stories and music from the radio still stuck in his voice. Other evenings he vanished into himself without leaving the room. You could not ask for the wrong thing on those nights. You could not need too brightly. By the time Mara was old enough to understand love as a pattern rather than a feeling, she had already absorbed its first lessons. Be easy. Be grateful. Notice moods before they become trouble. Do not ask at the moment someone is tired. Do not want so much that your wanting becomes the problem. So when Daniel loved her in ways that were reliable, visible, and undeniably real, some old part of her relaxed. Not because it was everything, because it was solid. And for a long time, solid felt sacred. In the beginning, they had been easy together in all the ways people secretly pray for. They met at a friend's birthday dinner where neither of them knew enough people to feel comfortable, and by the end of the night were standing outside the restaurant under the weak amber of a street lamp, talking not about anything impressive, but about ordinary things with a degree of attention that made them feel newly lit from within. Books they had not finished. Cities they were half afraid to visit alone. Why some songs seemed to find you only when you were already becoming the person who could understand them. Daniel was not dazzling. That was part of his appeal. He did not perform interest, he gave it. When she spoke, he seemed to set the rest of himself aside and listen with his whole face. When he laughed, it came from somewhere unguarded. On their third date, he remembered a passing comment she had made about loving old apartments with deep windowsills and took her on a walk through a neighborhood lined with buildings exactly like that. On their fifth, he brought her the ginger candies she liked because he remembered she sometimes got motion sick in cabs. His sweetness did not feel strategic. It felt native. There had been desire, too, in those first years. Not frantic, but alive. He used to kiss her in the kitchen while waiting for pasta water to boil. used to catch her wrist lightly as she passed and pull her back toward him with a look that still made her stomach warm when she remembered it. Used to tell her, in that low way of his, that she looked beautiful when she was half undressed and laughing at him for saying so. She had believed then that what they were building would deepen rather than flatten. And in some ways it did. They became a life. There were shared Sunday mornings and hardware store runs and winter colds and one terrible landlord and 100 small jokes only the two of them understood. He knew exactly how she liked her eggs. She knew he needed quiet for 20 minutes after work before he became himself again. They adopted Pippa after 6 months of saying they were only looking. They made a home in layers without announcing it. His mug by the coffee maker, her books on the nightstand. A framed photograph from a weekend at the coast. A second set of keys. Their bodies learning the geography of cohabitation until even inconvenience softened into intimacy. It did not break all at once. That would have been easier. There was no betrayal, no affair, no cruelty sharp enough to point at and say there is the wound. There was only the slow accumulation of omissions. Compliments grew rarer first. At first Mara barely noticed. People settled, that was normal. You could not stay in the heightened language of new love forever. Then one day, getting dressed for dinner with friends, she came out in a black dress Daniel used to love and turned once in front of him, half playful, giving him an opening he would once have taken easily. He looked up from tying his shoe and said, "That works." That works. Not unkind, not even inattentive by ordinary standards, but the sentence landed in her like a drawer quietly closing. She smiled anyway, said good, and reached for her earrings. Things like that became common, not rejection exactly, just a lack of arrival. She would lean into him on the couch and he would stroke her shoulder absent-mindedly without turning toward her. She would mention feeling tired and he would say, "You should get more sleep," instead of, "Come here." She would try to tell him something fragile about her day and he would listen, nod, offer a solution. Always a solution. He was excellent at solutions, less fluent in witness. Even their intimacy changed texture. There were still nights they made love, but increasingly it felt assumed rather than discovered. Familiar, functional, tender sometimes, but not searching. Not the kind of touch that says I am here with you, fully, curiously, now. Several times she nearly said it. Once in bed late, after they had brushed their teeth and turned out the light. She was facing his back, the room washed in that faint blue glow from the street lamp outside. She wanted to ask, "Do you still desire me?" The question rose to her throat with such force it startled her. But then he sighed and said, "I'm exhausted," and shifted deeper into the pillow, and she swallowed the words so quickly it was as though they had never existed. Another time they were driving home from his sister's house after dinner, the car full of the intimate dark that sometimes makes truth feel more possible. His hand was on the wheel, music low, her window cracked open to the cool air. She looked at his profile and thought, say it now. Ask him why he never looks at you like he used to. Ask him if he feels the distance too. Ask him if this is what love becomes or if the two of you have lost your way inside it. But she pictured his silence, his confusion, the small furrow that formed between his brows when emotions arrived without clear instructions, and fear translated longing into something safer. "Did you remember we're almost out of cat litter?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "I'll get it tomorrow." And that was how it kept happening. She mistook postponement for protection. He mistook the absence of complaint for stability. A relationship can survive many things. What it cannot survive forever is one person speaking an ache while the other hears only logistics. There had been one day, late in the last year, that almost convinced her to stay. It was October, cold enough for socks, not yet cold enough for heaviness. Mara had worked from home that Friday and Daniel came back early with a paper bag from the bakery down the street because he knew she had been buried in a deadline all week. They ate still warm almond croissants at the kitchen counter, laughing because Pippa sat at their feet with the theatrical heartbreak of a creature, convinced she had been cheated by fate. Later they cooked together, not in any romantic movie way, just gently, passing each other spices, reaching around each other in the small kitchen, Daniel touching the back of her waist without thinking. At one point she turned and nearly collided with him, and he smiled, really smiled with that old softness in it and kissed her forehead. Such a small thing, so devastating in its ordinariness. After dinner, they took Pippa on a long walk through streets full of leaves. Mara tucked her hand into his coat pocket because her fingers were cold. Daniel squeezed them there. For several hours, she felt the old ease return. Not even return exactly. Surface. As though it had been under the floorboards all along, and all they had needed was a day quiet enough to hear it breathing. That night, lying in bed, she thought maybe she had been too anxious. Too hungry, too in her head. Maybe this was what mature love looked like, mostly routine, occasionally luminous. Maybe adulthood was learning not to panic each time tenderness changed its clothes. The next morning, Daniel woke early to watch something on his phone and forgot to kiss her before leaving the bed. By evening, they were back on the couch, side by side, making comments about a show neither of them cared much about, their bodies close but not meeting. That was the trap. It was not all empty. Just not enough. The week after the breakup, memory turned traitor. It did not show her the deadened evenings first. It showed her goodness. It showed her Daniel in the pharmacy aisle comparing cold medicines because he knew she always bought the wrong kind when sick. Daniel kneeling on the kitchen floor repairing the cabinet hinge before it failed completely because he noticed these things before they became emergencies. Daniel coming home with her favorite tea. Daniel setting a heating pad on her side of the bed before she got in during her period. Daniel, who once drove across town in the rain because she had forgotten her laptop charger at a cafe and had a presentation due the next morning. Daniel, who never forgot Pippa's worming tablets. Daniel, who brought her home. What kind of fool leaves a man like that? The question circled constantly, low and mean. It visited at 2 a.m., it visited in the produce aisle. It visited while folding laundry, pairing socks that had once belonged to a life coherent enough to name. It visited when she looked at other people's marriages from the outside and felt suddenly adolescent for having wanted something as unquantifiable as more feeling. Sometimes she tried to answer it by becoming colder inside herself. You didn't leave because you were bored, she would think. You left because you were lonely. You left because you kept trying to be satisfied by being managed. You left because every time you needed to be met in language, in vulnerability, in desire, you ended up swallowing yourself. But even when she said all of that, grief argued back. Maybe you expected too much. Maybe everyone becomes quieter after enough years. Maybe what you called loneliness was ordinary adulthood. Maybe all love eventually becomes practical if it survives. Those were the nights she cried hardest. Not because she wanted Daniel back with certainty, but because heartbreak is most unbearable when it arrives without a villain. When there is no clean anger to hold. When the person you miss is also the person beside whom you began to vanish. On the 8th day after he left, Mara went looking for batteries in the hall closet and found one of Daniel's hoodies on the top shelf, folded beneath an extra blanket. She pulled it down before she thought better of it. It smelled faintly of his detergent and something else, something less nameable. The warm, neutral scent of his skin after work. She sat on the hallway floor holding it in both hands, not even wearing it, just holding it, as though her body understood there are griefs too old to be soothed by metaphor. She remembered one winter 3 years earlier, when she had been up late finishing a pitch, and Daniel had come into the living room half asleep, put that same hoodie over her shoulders because she was shivering, and kissed the top of her head before going back to bed. He had not said anything grand, just, "You're freezing." That was the complication no one saw. He had loved her. Not falsely, not performatively, not carelessly. He had loved her in his language. But love can be sincere and still leave someone starving. Mara had spent too much of her life believing that if something was not intentionally harmful, she had no right to name the hurt. That belief had kept her in many rooms longer than truth would have chosen. 3 days later, her sister Lena came over with Thai food and the kind of practical tenderness that never made Mara feel handled. Lena was 4 years older and had the weathered steadiness of a woman who had already learned several hard lessons without turning them into her whole personality. She was not sentimental in the obvious way, but she loved fiercely and with very little performance. She took off her shoes at the door, knelt to scratch Pippa behind the ears, and said, "You look terrible," in a voice warm enough to count as affection. "Thank you," Mara said. "I brought noodles and those dumplings you like. I might marry you." "Please don't, you already look exhausted." Mara laughed, and the laugh hurt in her throat. They ate at the kitchen table because the couch still felt too much like a wound. For a while they spoke of harmless things. Work, their mother's latest fixation with air fryers. A neighbor Lena was feuding with over a parking spot, but grief sat at the edge of the room like a patient relative. Eventually Lena set down her chopsticks and said, very quietly, "Tell me what's actually happening in your head." Mara looked at the condensation on her water glass. "I think I made a mistake," she said. Lena did not answer immediately. "Because you want him back." "Because I can't stop missing him." "That's not the same thing." Mara swallowed. "I know." "Do you?" There was no accusation in it. That made it harder. Mara pressed her fingers into the table. "He was good to me." "I know." "He took care of everything." "I know." "I don't even know if what I wanted was realistic anymore. Maybe this is just what relationships become if they last." Lena leaned back slightly, studying her with that maddening older sister gaze that always seemed to separate what was being said from what was true. "Mara," she said, "did you feel loved?" Mara's mouth opened, then closed. "Yes," she said finally, "in some ways." Lena nodded. "Did you feel alone?" The answer came too fast. "And yes." And there it was, clean, irreducible. Lena looked down for a moment, then back at her. "A relationship can be loving and still leave you lonely." Mara's eyes filled before she could stop them. "I hate that sentence," she whispered. "I know." It would almost be easier if he'd been cruel, or selfish, or if there were something obvious I could point to, something ugly enough to justify leaving. But there was. "No," Mara laughed once shakily. "There was folded laundry and grocery lists and him bringing me tea." Lena's face softened. "That doesn't make your loneliness less real." Mara looked away. The window above the sink reflected the kitchen back at her, the dim room superimposed against black glass. For one disorienting second, she felt as though she were watching another woman sit at this table and struggle not to apologize for her own heart. "I didn't tell him enough," she said. "Not really." Lena was quiet. "I hinted," Mara went on. "I made comments. I asked if we were okay. I said I missed us sometimes, but I never—" She stopped, ashamed by the scale of it. "I never told him how bad it was. I never said I feel invisible. I never said I don't feel wanted by you anymore. I never said I'm so lonely beside you that I cry in the shower so I won't have to explain my face afterward." The silence after that sentence was not empty. It held her. "Why not?" Lena asked gently. Mara let out a breath that trembled on the way out. "Because if I said it plainly," she whispered, "then he could say it back plainly. He could say he didn't know how to give me that. Or worse, he could try and still not mean it. Or he could look at me like I was asking for too much." Lena's expression changed, not surprise, not pity, but recognition. "So you abandoned yourself first." The words hit with such accuracy Mara almost flinched. For the rest of that night, after Lena had gone home and the containers were stacked in the sink, and Pippa had curled into sleep at the foot of the bed, Mara lay awake staring into the dark and felt the story of the breakup tilt beneath her. Until then, she had been asking herself one question over and over. Did I make a mistake leaving a good man? Now another question rose beneath it, quieter and far more dangerous. Why did I believe my needs were safest when left unsaid? That was the real midpoint of grief. Not when you stop missing them, when you stop arranging the past so you can remain innocent inside it. Daniel had not known the full depth of what was breaking in her, because she had never truly let him see it. She had shown him the edges, never the center. There had been opportunities. One Sunday morning in January, they were making coffee in the same kitchen where she now stood alone, and Daniel mentioned booking a weekend away in the spring, if things settled down at work. Mara had looked at him then, at his familiar face, his capable hands, the life they were still casually planning, and felt a wave of panic so strong it sharpened her voice. "When do things ever settle down?" she asked. He blinked. "I don't know, hopefully soon." "That's what you always say." He looked confused. "About work?" She almost said, "No, about us, about this, about the way I keep waiting for us to come back alive to each other while you talk like time is a neutral thing." But the fear came in too quickly. The fear of spoiling the morning. The fear of sounding dramatic before coffee. The fear of reaching toward the center and finding no one there. So instead she said, "Never mind," and opened the cupboard harder than necessary. He touched her shoulder. "Hey, are you okay?" And because the question was too broad and not broad enough, she answered, "I'm just tired." "I'm just tired." How many women had buried their whole heartbreak inside that sentence? The worst part was that Daniel probably believed her. Not because he didn't care. Because she had trained him to. She had become so skilled at minimizing her own ache that even when she leaked around the edges, she looked manageable. That realization did not make her regret leaving. It made her grieve more honestly. Because now she had to mourn not only the love that failed to meet her, but the self who kept translating longing into something smaller so she would not seem difficult to love. One rainy Thursday night, nearly 2 weeks after the breakup, the dog got sick. Not gravely, just suddenly and messily, in the way living things sometimes do when the hour is wrong and the house is quiet and no one is emotionally prepared to become the only adult present. Pippa woke Mara at 1:30, whining by the bed. By the time Mara got the lamp on, the dog had already been sick on the rug. Mara moved too fast, bare feet cold on the floor, one hand reaching for paper towels, the other trying to soothe the trembling little body pressed against her ankle. In another life, Daniel would already have been awake. He would have lifted Pippa gently, checked her gums, opened the back door, gotten the cleaning spray, spoken in that low, unpanicked voice that made every inconvenience seem temporary. Mara would have been beside him, still upset but not alone inside the upset. Instead, she was standing in the middle of the living room at nearly 2 in the morning with a shivering dog, a stained rug, and panic blooming far too large for the situation. She got Pippa outside, cleaned the floor badly, called the emergency vet and sat on hold while trying not to cry. When someone finally answered and told her it was likely not urgent unless the vomiting continued, she thanked them, wrote down instructions with a hand that would not stop shaking, and hung up. Then she sat on the kitchen floor. The tiles were cold through her pajama pants. Pippa curled against her shin, subdued now, exhausted. The sink was full of paper towels, and the apartment smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain. Mara looked automatically toward the place where Daniel would have been. Toward nothing. The grief that came then was disproportionate and total. It had very little to do with the dog by that point. It was grief for the scaffolding, for the witness, for the quiet assurance of another competent body in the room, for all the practical love that had once made her feel held, and all the emotional absence that had made that holding insufficient. And beneath both of those was another grief, rawer still. Grief for the woman who had needed so much from someone, she never fully told the truth. She covered her mouth with one hand and cried into her palm so she would not frighten Pippa. By morning, the dog was better. Mara was not. She moved through the next day in a daze, answered emails she did not absorb, changed into clean clothes she could not feel on her skin. At 3 in the afternoon, she stood at the sink rinsing a mug and suddenly saw herself with almost painful clarity. Not a woman destroyed by leaving, but a woman confronting the cost of having arranged her life around being quietly handled. Daniel had been many things for her: loving, reliable, good-hearted, limited. He had also become a place where she outsourced certain forms of aliveness. Not because he demanded it, because she let the structure of being loved practically substitute for the harder work of being known fully, even by herself. That evening, she opened her laptop and began to write him a message. Not to send, she knew that before the first word appeared. The act of writing was for excavation now, not return. She typed his name at the top of the blank page and sat there for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum. Then she began. To Daniel, I have been trying to turn what happened into something simple, but it wasn't simple, and you deserve better than a false version of the truth. She stopped, read it back, kept going. I loved you, I still do, in the way people often still love someone after they've understood they cannot remain. That hasn't vanished just because I left. In some ways, the leaving has made it more painful to admit. You took care of me beautifully in so many ways. You made our life safer, easier, steadier. You noticed things before they became problems. You carried a lot, I know that. I know how much of your love lived in those actions, and I don't want to rewrite you into someone careless just because I was hurting. But I was hurting. And I need to say this plainly, because I did not while we were together. I felt lonely with you for a long time. Not because you were cruel, not because I doubted your loyalty, because I stopped feeling reached for by you. I stopped feeling seen in the places that made me feel most alive as a woman. I missed being wanted out loud. I missed emotional depth. I missed feeling like my inner world was not something we kept skimming past on the way to dinner plans and errands. She paused again, heart pounding though no one was there to hear it. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. I also need to be honest about myself. I did not tell you enough. I hinted, I softened, I edited. I tried to be reasonable when what I really was lonely and ashamed of how lonely. I was afraid that if I said it plainly, I would become too much. And that wasn't fair to either of us. You could not fully respond to a truth I kept presenting as a preference. Still, not saying it clearly did not make it less real. I don't think you failed me in the way heartbreak stories often like to name failure. I think we loved in different languages, and I kept hoping silence would somehow translate mine for you. It didn't. There it was. The sentence she had been living toward. She cried then, but not in the untethered way of earlier nights. This was grief with shape, grief that could finally bear witness to itself. When she was finished, she did not reread the whole thing. She saved the document under a plain name and closed the laptop. For the first time since the breakup, she did not feel pulled toward texting him. Not because she no longer missed him. Because missing him was no longer the only voice in the room. Truth had entered too. The apartment changed slowly after that. Not magically, not all at once. Grief is not a curtain that lifts. It is more like winter loosening in the ground, difficult to perceive day by day, undeniable over time. Mara began with small reclamations. She moved the blanket from the couch and washed it, not because it no longer smelled like him, it barely did by then, but because she wanted to choose where things belonged rather than leave them as relics. She bought different coffee beans, took his cereal to the office kitchen so she would stop seeing it every morning. Rearranged the bookshelf in the living room, replacing the framed photo from the coast with a small print she had kept tucked in a drawer for months, because Daniel said the colors were a bit much for the room. She planted rosemary in the window box. She learned how to jumpstart her own car from a video on her phone and felt ridiculous and triumphant in equal measure. These were not dramatic acts. That was what made them holy. The first Saturday she walked Pippa alone along the long path by the river where she and Daniel used to go together, she nearly turned back twice. The air was cold and bright. Couples passed with strollers, with coffees, with the unconscious choreography of people still inside a shared future. Mara felt every one of them like a bruise. But Pippa trotted ahead, ears up, interested in leaves and pigeons and the democratic wonders of other dogs' scents. At one point, the leash tugged and Mara laughed despite herself because Pippa had found a stick twice her size and was trying to drag it home with absurd determination. The sound of her own laughter startled her. It had been a long time since anything in her body arrived without first consulting grief. She stood there under the pale sky, the river moving dark and steady beside the path, and let the moment be exactly what it was. Not healing, not closure. Just life continuing in a body that had once believed it might collapse from its own sorrow. Weeks passed. Daniel texted only about logistics. The rent transfer, a package delivered by mistake, a question about whether she wanted him to keep paying half the pet insurance for a few months until things settle. His messages were polite, restrained, almost painfully consistent with who he had always been. Helpful, decent, adjacent to the actual wound. Once, after she answered a question about the utility account, he wrote, "Hope Pippa's okay." She looked tired in that photo. Mara stared at the message for a long time. So many old reflexes rose at once. The desire to tell him about the night Pippa got sick, the almost unbearable sweetness of being noticed, the grief of realizing how instantly her heart lined toward even this small evidence that he still saw something of her life. She typed, "She's better now, thanks for asking." Then she put the phone face down and went to stand by the window until the wanting passed through her without turning into action. There were moments still when she missed him with an ache so total it made nuance feel like punishment. On those nights, memory did not come philosophically. It came bodily. She missed the shape of him in the kitchen, the sound of his key in the lock, the easy division of labor that had once made adulthood feel less like a private endurance test. She missed the way he reached automatically for the heavy grocery bags. She missed not having to remember every practical thing alone. But increasingly, when memory brought back his goodness, truth came beside it. She also remembered the way conversation thinned whenever she tried to go deeper than weather and work and plans. The way he would say, "I don't know what you want me to say," with quiet frustration, and how quickly shame would flood her. The nights she dressed carefully and felt unseen. The mornings she waited for a kiss that arrived like habit rather than recognition. The specific loneliness of being treated with care while remaining emotionally unfound. She learned, slowly, to let both truths exist without forcing them into war. He cared for me. I was still alone. I did not say enough. What I needed was still real. He loved me. It was not the love my heart could rest inside. That was the hardest maturity heartbreak demanded of her. Not certainty, but complexity without self-betrayal. In late March, Lena convinced her to come for dinner. Mara almost canceled twice, claiming work, then migraines, then the vague exhaustion grief grants itself as authority. But Lena did not allow it. "Wear actual pants," she said over the phone. "I'm making lasagna. I don't want to be around people. It's me and my husband, he barely counts as people." So Mara went. Lena's apartment smelled like garlic and basil, and the kind of warmth that comes not from decoration but from inhabitation. There was music playing softly. A candle burned on the windowsill. Her brother-in-law handed Mara a glass of wine and disappeared tactfully into the realm of oven temperatures. After dinner, Lena found her standing alone on the balcony, looking out over the lit windows of neighboring buildings. "You drifted," Lena said. Mara smiled faintly. "I'm practicing." "At what?" "Being a slightly haunted woman in a tasteful city." Lena laughed, then stood beside her in silence. After a moment, Mara said, "I don't think I want him back." Lena turned her head. "That sounds different from before." "Oh, it is." "What changed?" Mara watched a curtain move in a window across the street. "I finally realized missing a person and being met by them are not the same thing." Lena did not speak. "I think," Mara said slowly, "for a while I thought my grief meant I made the wrong choice. But grief just means something mattered. It doesn't mean it was enough." A softness moved over Lena's face, almost pride but gentler. "And," Mara added, looking down at her wine glass, "I think I'm starting to understand that going back would not just be going back to him. It would be going back to the version of me who kept waiting to be emotionally noticed instead of asking to be fully known." Lena reached over and squeezed her hand once. That, she said, is the whole thing. Mara slept deeply that night for the first time in months. Not because pain had ended. Because some argument inside her had. Spring came cautiously. The light changed first, then the air, then the fact of other people opening their windows again. Mara began to inhabit her life differently. She worked from cafes sometimes, not because she needed to, but because the apartment no longer had to hold every hour of her sadness. She bought herself flowers without waiting for occasion. She resumed a yoga class she had stopped attending because Daniel's schedule once made Wednesdays easier if she stayed home for dinner. She invited a friend from work over for soup and discovered, to her surprise, that laughter could now exist in the living room without feeling like disrespect toward what had happened there. One afternoon, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror on the way out, hair loosely pinned, trench coat open, keys in hand, and paused. For a moment, she saw not the woman who had been left with an apartment full of ghosts, but the woman who had survived becoming her own witness. The distinction undid her more than sorrow once had. Because that had always been the deepest wound, hadn't it? Not merely that Daniel could not love her in the language she needed. That she herself had so long believed her deepest needs must be translated into something less inconvenient before they deserved air. She thought then of all the times she had reduced her own heart to preserve peace, all the moments she had replaced truth with timing, with softness, with later. She did not hate that woman. She felt tenderness toward her now. She understood what made her, the childhood whether that trained her, the old fear that needing visibly meant risking departure, the instinct to protect connection even if the cost was self-erasure. But understanding no longer meant obedience. Mara had changed. Not into someone harder. That would have been too simple and not really growth at all. She had changed into someone more willing to disappoint love than disappear inside it. That spring, Daniel asked if she wanted to meet for coffee to talk through a few practical things in person. She knew there were not enough practical things left to require coffee. For 2 hours before answering, she sat with every feeling: curiosity, fear, tenderness, the old reflexive hope that perhaps now that it was too late, the emotional clarity she had once begged life for might finally arrive wearing his face. In the end, she wrote back, "I think email is better for me right now. Send me whatever you need to discuss." His reply came 20 minutes later. "Of course, I understand." She stared at those 3 words. "I understand." Did he? Perhaps in his way. Perhaps not at all. For the first time, she did not need to know. By early May, the apartment no longer looked exactly like love after he left. It looked like her. Not in some magazine sense. In a truer one, books stacked in unreasonable places, a bowl of oranges on the counter because she liked the color. The print with too much color framed over the desk, a new throw on the chair by the window, a half-dead plant she was stubbornly reviving, running shoes by the door, Pippa's leash coiled neatly on the hook she had installed herself after watching a tutorial twice and swearing at the wall only once. There were still evenings when loneliness came in quietly and sat beside her. But it no longer wore Daniel's face every time. Sometimes it was just loneliness, human, passing, unromantic, a feeling, not a prophecy. And when she missed him now, as she still sometimes did, she let the missing be honest. She missed his kindness, his steadiness, the way he made daily life more navigable. She missed being partnered in visible ways. She missed the dignity of ordinary care. But she no longer mistook missing for meaning. One Sunday morning, months after the breakup, Mara woke early to sunlight on the bedspread and the sound of Pippa shifting at the foot of the mattress. The apartment was quiet in that clean, almost sacred way mornings sometimes are before the world has had time to become demanding. She lay there for a minute, listening. No grief ambushed her. No memory rose with claws. Just morning. She got up, opened the curtains, fed the dog, and made coffee. Not Daniel's coffee, her own. The stronger kind she had started buying because she liked it, though he always thought it tasted a little aggressive. She stood barefoot in the kitchen waiting for the kettle and watched the light gather on the counter. There was sorrow in her still, of course there was. Heartbreak does not vanish because wisdom has arrived, but sorrow had changed shape. It no longer made her feel banished from her own life. It moved through rooms she now fully inhabited. After breakfast, she took Pippa out and walked farther than usual, down toward the florist on the corner. Buckets of peonies stood outside in the cool air, petals folded tight as secrets. Mara bought a small bunch in a paper sleeve and carried them home under her arm. Back in the apartment, she trimmed the stems and placed them in a glass vase at the center of the table. Then she stood there, looking at them, and felt something bloom so quietly she almost missed it. Not happiness, self-trust. The kind that grows when a woman has suffered her own life honestly enough to stop negotiating against herself. She thought of Daniel then, not with accusation, not with longing sharp enough to tear, but with the tender sadness reserved for things that were real and insufficient. He had helped her build a life. Losing him had taught her how to inhabit one. And perhaps that was what heartbreak had been trying to give her all along, not punishment, not even correction, but return. A return to the voice she kept translating into silence. A return to the body that knew the difference between being cared for and being cherished. A return to the woman who could hold complexity without using it as an excuse to stay hungry. That night, when the apartment dimmed and evening settled into the corners, Mara sat on the couch with a book she was only half reading while Pippa slept against her thigh. Outside, someone in the building across the street was laughing. Somewhere downstairs, a pan clattered. The ordinary noises of other lives went on. Mara set the book aside and looked around the room. The room did not accuse her anymore. It did not ask whether she had been right or wrong. It simply held the evidence of a woman returned to herself slowly, with difficulty and without spectacle. She touched the edge of the blanket beside her, then reached down to stroke Pippa's warm back. For the first time in a very long time, the silence around her did not feel like abandonment. It felt like space. And inside that space, something gentle and unmistakable had begun. Not certainty, not armor, not the hard, shiny confidence of never needing again. Something better. The willingness to ask, next time, for the kind of love that could answer. The willingness to say, plainly and before too much was lost, this is where I live. This is where I want to be met. The willingness to believe that such wanting did not make her difficult, it made her alive. She still missed him, sometimes with a softness that felt almost like prayer. But she no longer called loneliness devotion. She no longer bowed to the old religion of grateful hunger. She had loved a good man and still been alone. She had kept silent and still deserved to be heard. She had left without certainty and arrived at last in self-trust. And on certain evenings, when the light went pink at the windows and the dog shifted in her sleep and the kettle began its low pre-song in the kitchen, Mara could feel it with a quiet so complete it almost sounded like grace. Heartbreak had not ended her. It had rewritten her. She could finally hold both truths. He cared for her and she had still been alone. If something in this story felt familiar, if it touched a place you don't often put into words, I'd love to hear what stayed with you. You can share it in the comments, quietly, in your own way. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that sit with you and gently help you return to yourself, you can subscribe and stay close.